Welcome this morning. Nice to have a sunny response. You know, the groundhog saw his shadow this morning, so this morning's lecture is sponsored by Religion in the Arts and Contemporary Culture here at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Today is event number 2 in a series of 4 events that begin with a sharp focus on Flannery O'Connor and kind of end in a discussion with songwriters on the crosstalk between songwriting and literary influences. It was a treat last week for us to hear Victor Judge, and Victor's talk was called The Incarnational Art of Flannery O'Connor. We're going to move from today to the 19th of February in a public event at the Mercy Lounge, which is in Old Cannery Row down on Faith Avenue. And it's a musical concert, and the concert will benefit the Flannery O'Connor Andalusia Foundation, which is the nonprofit that cares for Flannery's farm and personal and some of her literary effects. Literary sites are in big trouble in this country. It's hard to come by money, and so we've turned this event toward them. It's going to be a great night of music, literature, and theater. Our performers that night will be storyteller Minton Sparks, alt pop band Over the Rhine, a singer-songwriter Mary Gaucher, and bluegrass jazz group Old Black Kettle. And on top of that, Denise Hicks from the Nashville Shakespeare Festival will be doing 3 vignettes in character as Flannery. So that's the 19th of February. It's a benefit. It's $15 at the door, $10 if you're a Vanderbilt Divinity or GDR student. So you'll see these posters around. Please take notice. We caught Flannery on a particularly sunny day. Following that, our final event will be, it may be here in this room. If it's not, it'll be upstairs in what's now called the reading room, the old refectory. And that's called Shadows of the Word, Songwriters and Literary Legacies of Religion and Place. It features all of the artists that will be performing at Mercy Lounge with a moderator, Julie Height. And we'll be exploring the creative process of songwriters and how they appropriate their influences from literature and from the other arts as well. Today, we're very pleased and appreciative to have Dr. Michael Kreyling here. His talk this morning is Take Heed, Watch, the Meaning of the O'Connor Story Comes Like a Thief. If you would please welcome Michael Kreyling.
Thanks, Dave. I feel like I'm under interrogation. I also want to say that those of you who were here last week to hear Victor Judge's talk heard, I think, one of the best, if not the best, overall introduction to the person and the themes of Flannery O'Connor that I've heard. And I've heard lots of them, believe me. And that was one of the best, if not the best. So if that's on tape somewhere, you should go put it on your iPod or cell phone or something and watch it again. I'm not going to be as polished. What I've got in mind is more like discussion or lecture discussion rather than a fixed sort of thing that I read. Although I am going to start with a text. Oh, maybe I should back up a little bit more. When Victor started last time, he also mentioned the sort of biographical things that bring one into collision or whatever with Flannery O'Connor. And what I was struck with when I heard him last week was the coincidences. He talked about, did you not talk about having a confessor at the Trappist Monastery in Conyers, Georgia? I once went to Gethsemane, the Trappist Monastery in Kentucky. Right after I graduated from college, I thought I might be a monk. I also went to try to find Thomas Merton because I figured he I was going to be Thomas Merton when I grew up. I got down there after a long drive, and the solitude, the quiet, the absolute exile or so forth from the world so freaked me out that I got back in the car. The engine wasn't even cool yet. I got back in the car and drove back to the secular world, and here I am today. And I have been, to a certain extent, trying to avoid Flannery O'Connor ever since, because I was educated in Catholic schools from kindergarten through college. And I have had a lot of doctrine and a lot of the Catholic spin on things. And so I've tried to stay away from Flannery O'Connor, except, the line from The Godfather, every time you think you've gotten away, they pull you back in. And Flannery keeps pulling me back in. So what you will hear from me is a kind of attraction and resistance bond with Flannery O'Connor that sometimes may end up with more inconsistency than consistency, more questions than conclusions about what's going on in her stories. So I just offer that as a disclaimer at the beginning. And I do welcome interruptions and questions along the way if you feel so inclined. I wanted to start with a text from the Bible, the Gospel of Mark. It seemed appropriate. So I'll read it. It's from Mark. I think this is on most of the blurbs or the publicity for this particular talk. This is Mark chapter 13, verses 14 to 37. It's a little long, but when you see the this is from the Revised Standard Version. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. And this, what I want to sort of communicate with this is that this is both a theological document and a literary document, because this passage from Mark sets up a literary scenario. It sets up at least major parts, if not a whole, of a literary scenario that I think O'Connor used, especially in her first collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find, to construct her stories so that the meaning of the stories in its theological register and the structure of the stories are braided together in ways that first we should appreciate, and then second, we should sort of critique to see if how that braiding takes place and if there are any gaps or omissions in it. But when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything away. And let him who is in the field not turn back to take his mantle. And alas for those who are with child and for those who give suck in those days. Pray that it may not happen in the winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not shortened the days, no human being would be saved. And for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. It seems to me really important in this particular case to get a sense of the elect. Because I think that concept sticks in O'Connor, at least in these early stories, and it sticks out in the stories as an important badge or marker on some of the characters. And it also migrates over into us, the reader, because there are ways in which we become tempted, I think, reading her stories, to think of ourselves as the elect, getting the message of the text better than the people in the stories, which is sometimes deceptive. And if the Lord had not shortened the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, don't believe it. False Christs and false prophets will arise and show signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, for you do not know when the time will come. What I take that to mean then is that is both a theological position and a story writer's position. And about the latter, here's what I mean. What that passage communicates in terms of a literary scenario is that there is an initial equilibrium in which elect and non-elect are present in the world. There's an initial equilibrium made up of the elect and those who aren't elect. There is a natural world, but it is basically it basically functions symbolically. The heavens especially function symbolically. The natural world is there to be a vocabulary of symbols, and mostly a vocabulary of symbols of an apocalyptic nature. So there is a sort of equilibrium with which the story starts, and an understanding that language is basically functions in a symbolic way, at least the language of nature does. Now into this equilibrium comes the Christ, the Savior. You don't know when he's going to come. You don't know from what direction this person is going to come. But he's coming, and you don't know when, you don't know where. But he enters and disrupts the equilibrium. Now, the process of disruption is basically a distribution of knowledge between those who are elect, but maybe don't know it, and those who think they are elect but aren't, and then another group who is neither elect nor not elect, or at least not part of that group. Now, not all the stories that I want to talk about this morning will comprise all of those sort of character groups. The displaced person, which I want to spend most time on, does comprise them all. A good man is hard to find, has, I think, 2 of those groups, maybe 2.5 and so forth, but we'll get to that in a minute. So you have this initial equilibrium comprised of the elect and the non-elect and other people who are sort of not in the equation. The stranger or disruptor comes in. He brings with him, it's a he brings with him grace. He brings with him the ultimate sort of confrontation with the truth, with the Father. Many of the characters who think they're elect but aren't don't recognize this person. Or if they do recognize him, as one of the characters says, they don't acknowledge his presence. Some of the characters do recognize, like there's a big argument that goes on and on for generations of critics about whether the grandmother in A Good Man from Hard to Find in the last second of her life recognizes her Savior or not. Or whether the Savior she thinks she recognizes is one of the false Christs that Mark talks about. That's what I mean. There's a lot of open ends to these questions, to these stories. That the elect either recognize the Savior and acknowledge his presence, or recognize him and deny it, or don't recognize him and go on. So that the stories start off with an equilibrium that is ignorant. There is an interloper or Savior or Messiah character who enters and disturbs that equilibrium. There is a moment of recognition. And then there's an aftermath to that moment of recognition, which is usually in the O'Connor story a rickety, ramshackle attempt to recreate the equilibrium that existed before the interloper came into the scene. And usually the story ends with a second iteration of a natural symbolic scene, a sunset sometimes, usually a sunset, or a storm. Something that naturally and symbolically comments on the theological or others or psychological or both conflict about on which the story centered. So that's the sort of, that's what I take out of Mark. And that's, I think, what I take out of Mark and translate over to O'Connor's stories. And I basically this morning think that that scenario applies most directly and most relevantly to the first collection of her stories and the novel that came out early on, Wise Blood. The first collection is Good Man is Hard to Find. The second collection, Everything That Rises Must Converge, includes stories from the later 1950s up into the early 60s and her death. And that there's a different sort of scenario that covers those stories, I think. Bits and pieces of this one that I've mentioned here, but also bits and pieces of another one. If there's time left toward the end, I wanted to get to one of those stories, Everything That Rises Must Converge, and make some comments in an attempt to sort of contrast the scenario of the early stories to that later one. So that's basically the outline. Take a look, not take a look, you don't have the book, but think of the story of the misfit, A Good Man is Hard to Find. There is in that story, there is an initial equilibrium. It's a troubled equilibrium. There is a family, Bailey and his wife and the two kids, Wesley and June Starr, and the grandmother. It's a sort of a nuclear family with one little spur. The grandmother sort of stuck on it. And they exist in the early couple of paragraphs in a kind of ironic or satiric equilibrium. They're a sort of satirical image of Ozzie and Harriet, of that 1950s stable nuclear family. Except we know from the early parts of the story that there are problems with that equilibrium. We don't see them directly, but we see them in the way the two children act. The two children have clearly picked up, either from the society at large or from their parents, some fairly disgusting personal habits that have to do mostly with a sense of their own class superiority. In other words, the two kids, I would read through Mark, think of themselves as the elect. They think they are the elect. And, they say things like, well, let me read you a couple of things that Wesley and June Starr say. I think June Starr says at one time something like, she says, I think, to Red Sammy, or Red Sammy's wife, when they stopped for barbecue on the trip, I wouldn't stay in a place like this for $1 million. Right to the hostess who offers her that kind of thing. And that's just typical of the kinds of things these kids say. Now, we laugh at those things because, we laugh at little kids saying, nasty things like that. But behind that is that those kids have picked up a sense of social superiority. They think they're elect. They think they're superior to other people that they meet on the road. The equilibrium and the superiority also has in this story racial and regional aspects. The grandmother quite obviously goes into this sort of false memory that she has of being descended from a plantation family. This is either a false memory or an inflated or bloated memory of her own past, which does make the story Southern, but it also inflects it in the Mark direction by making the grandmother have this sense of her own election. She is superior to the other people she meets. There is that, she says, she gets dressed up to go on the trip because she said if there ever was an accident, everybody would know. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets containing a sachet. in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. So there's, that's also funny, but that also keys into the sense that she feels of herself as a class apart. And what's interesting about that is that if there's time, when you get to everything that rises must converge, Julian's mother has the same sense of class superiority. And Julian is, to a certain extent, Wesley grown up, or Bailey, the grandmother's son, come back from the grave to, in a sense, interact with her all over again. But anyway, you see what I mean. There's this sense of equilibrium. The family's going on a vacation. There's this sense that they are the elect in some class, and also in the grandmother's case, in a racial sense. She sees a little black kid on the side of the road, and June Starr, I think, says something sort of negative about him. And the grandmother says, "Oh, look at the cute little pickaninny," and which, makes everybody cringe. And I'm sure O'Connor put it in there deliberately as just a sort of stenographic note to say, also the grandmother is as a racial supremacist. She might be a gentle old lady version of it, but she is one. And then they, you know the story, and they travel around, on the way, ostensibly going to Florida, and the grandmother talks her son into trying to find this mythical plantation that she remembers having grown up in. They have an accident, some sort of intrusion or interruption to the equilibrium, to the stasis occurs, and the misfit shows up. And the misfit and the grandmother, the misfit, starts to kill every member of the family, 2 at a time. And the misfit and the grandmother get into a theological discussion in which the grandmother says, "You're a good man, just pray, you'll be fine. I can tell that you've been raised well, and, just pray, pray, pray." But the misfit gets into a much more, it seems to me, conflicted and torturous sort of theological position. Basically, I think, boiled down and simplified, he gets into a conflict between an Old Testament theology and a New Testament theology. He says Jesus thrown everything off balance by coming back from the dead. Jesus also thrown everything off balance, it seems to me, in O'Connor's world, by giving us the idea in events like the Sermon on the Mount and other things, that if you do good things, like the grandmother says, you might help yourself get saved. But the misfit knows that that doesn't work. He goes to jail for something he didn't do, although he'd done a lot of other things they didn't catch him doing. But, you can go to jail for things you didn't do. He says, they said that I killed my daddy. I didn't kill my daddy. He was off somewhere else at the time, But he knows he's guilty. He just knows that he's not guilty for the things that they're getting him for. And so the misfit has this sense that when the moment comes, it'll be arbitrary, and there won't be anything that the mortal human being can do or could have done to make what happens next any better. There's nothing you can do to make sure that you get saved, whereas the grandmother at least gives lip service to that. Now, the point about the story that's almost a nanosecond long, and I think O'Connor probably did it this way on purpose, is that the grandmother reaches out, I think in the last second or more of her life, and touches the misfit and says, "You're one of my babies," and that's when he shoots her 3 times in the chest. And then he says in that sort of enigmatic way, she would have been a good woman if there'd been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Which sort of translates to mean if she could have lived her life with the very real and very imminent sense that she was going to die in the next nanosecond, she would have been one of the elect. Or at least would have, she would have been she would have done something. She would have done something constructive or whatever to her salvation, except she didn't do that. She lived on her own sort of self-generated myths of her election, her own sort of self-generated myths of her social and class superiority and so forth. And the misfit just continues then. The equilibrium continues after that moment, very briefly because the story ends almost immediately after that. But the misfit then becomes, the misfit then becomes the sort of central figure in the continuing equilibrium of the story. The story then ends without us having a really firm idea whether anybody who has just died, the whole family, actually does what Mark or what Jesus counsels the faithful to do in Mark's gospel, about whether anybody actually has taken heed and watched and has gotten the message. We just don't know, because they all get killed off stage except the grandmother. The cat survives, but nobody else human does. You see what I mean? There's a sort of a symmetry. I know you have to sort of squeeze and massage the symmetry of the story sometimes to make it fit. Sometimes it just won't. But there is a kind of symmetry in the overall sort of narrative or plot structure of these short stories. Any questions about that or objections? So basically what it seems to me is that a theological sort of attitude or temperament or belief is symmetrical to the story's basic narrative structure: equilibrium, intrusion, recognition, equilibrium again, or a damaged equilibrium that follows. And that basically follows the sort of theological point of view too. And I think what you could do then in the other stories, most of the other stories in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, is you can impose that template on the stories. And what happens is that template tends to bring out aspects of the stories that might slide by as humorous. And I don't want to sound too much like a Puritan sort of, I am. That's what I'm sounding like, I know. But, a lot of those things tend to come through as like, oh, isn't she a humorous, funny writer? But what's also going on under that is this sort of more rigid sort of theological position that she's got. Yeah.
I wonder if you could say anything, or if you can fit into sort of the way that you're talking about the story. The idea that the grandmother actually brings the doom on all of them, because if she hadn't misremembered the plantation, they wouldn't be driving down the road, and if she hadn't brought the cat that she was told not to bring, that leaps out that caused them to have an accident, they wouldn't have been there when the misfit came by.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on the fact that she sort of actively gets them into this predicament.
There's basically two sorts of answers to that. One is sort of biographical to O'Connor, and that has to do with her tangled relationship with her mother, Regina, whom she obviously depended on, but obviously wanted to get away from. And, once she got lupus, she couldn't. So there's this tangled relationship. If you read her letters about her mother, she loved her mother, I'm sure, but also she also got a little bit nuts listening to her mother's conversation a lot. And I think a lot of the conversations you hear, like with Mrs. Shortley and Mrs. McIntyre, or Mrs. Turpin, or other sort of mother or older maternal figures in the novel, who are having conversations like, Rome wasn't built in a day, and then somebody answers, with another cliche or another adage, and you think, you can imagine O'Connor just sitting there listening to this hour after hour, and thinking, and so part of it's biographical. She's trying to do something with her mother. Part of it's also sort of thematic, because what draws the grandmother there is this absolute certainty in her mythical Southern class past. And I think what O'Connor's doing there is elaborating or drawing out that class superiority that she wants to locate with the mother. So she goes off on this wild goose chase after a past that doesn't exist. That becomes, and it's also sort of intertextual too in a way, because that same thing happens in Everything That Rises Must Converge. Julian remembers the ancestral plantation that her mother, that his mother, you know, brags about all the time. But he remembers it's in a rotten old house that doesn't even have a second story on it, or doesn't have a stairway to the second story anymore, that has fallen into ruin. So there's that intertextual suggestion that, you know, the southernness of her class supremacy is also important. I mean, it's not just, in other words, it's not just class supremacy thought of abstractly, but regionalized. Yeah.
This may not be a fair question, but if the writer, because the writer takes these people as they are, but had they been a bit different, what kind of action could she have depicted to show they did recognize the messianic event or whatever, you know?
I think that happens in The Displaced Person,
Okay.
which I want to get to, you know, because that's a much longer story and it's much more complex.
Wait,
And I think the characters in there who bear some resemblance to the grandmother in that family have a much, not necessarily a totally positive response to the messianic intrusion or entrance, but they have a more complex one. It's clearer to me reading that story that they recognize the intruder, the displaced person, as the Christ. But it's also pretty clear that they go to great lengths to refute that to themselves once they realize what cost it's going to be to them, literally and figuratively. So if we can postpone that to that story, you might get a better answer to that. But so you can see, if you can then go through most of, but not all of the stories of A Good Man Is Hard to Find and impose that template. Say, for instance, in the story, The Life You Save May Be Your Own. The story opens with Lucy Nell and Lucy Nell, the mother and the daughter, sitting on the porch of their rotten sort of farmhouse when Mr. Shiflett comes in with obviously a very symbolic sunset going on in the heavens around them, described by O'Connor in very vivid, sort of extraordinary ways to make us aware of the symbolical nature of nature here. And that's what I take to be the sort of symmetry or the connection with the text from Mark, that, you know, the heavens will lose, you know, the stars will fall from the heavens and so forth. There will be there'll be signs that something impending is important, and the elect will understand the signs and interpret them properly, and the people who aren't elect will just think it's a storm and not know. Now Lucy Nell, the mother, sees the sunset as a sunset. You know, we have them every day. But Mr. Shiflett, who, you know, makes a sort of crucifix sort of form when he stands up to the sunset, Lucy Nell, the mother, doesn't see the crucifixion. She only sees the sunset. Remember that scene? You probably don't. But Mr. Shiflett comes on a one-armed man who's a carpenter, comes into the setting, and as the sun is setting over these sort of vividly depicted mountains or hills or something, he stands with his back to the two characters and puts out his arms like this. Clear to us who think of ourselves as the readers of being elect, Christ figure, I got your number, carpenter, crucifixion, okay, I got it. But Lucy Nell, the mother, only sees the sunset. She doesn't see the Savior. And her daughter, Lucy Nell, being a sort of retarded or whatever challenged individual, she just sees a boyfriend. She doesn't see any meaning in that at all. And then Mr. Shiflett comes on, and they get into a kind of discussion, Mr. Shiflett and Mrs. Crater, very similar to the kind of discussion that the misfit and the grandmother have in the other story about, you know, the moral nature of the modern world, and then, you know, you don't know, you know, people are just awful and people are bad to each other, and Mr. Shiflett says, you know, my name might be Shiflett, it might be this, it might be that, you don't know who I am, you don't, you know. But Miss Crater trusts him anyway, because she sees in him not necessarily a savior of the immortal soul, but a savior of her capital investment in the farm. Because she sees somebody who can actually raise the dead. He raises the dead car to life. So she sees him, recognizes him as a savior, but she recognizes him as a material or worldly one who is going to make the farm less capital draining for her, and is also going to get the daughter off her hands. And so, as that story goes along, she finances Mr. Shiflett's repairs and on the farm, then marries the daughter off to him, and sends him off on a honeymoon. Mr. Shiflett abandons Lucy Nell, the daughter, his wife, in a roadside diner, in which the counterman, a young sort of country guy, looks on Lucy Nell and says, "She's an angel of God." And so Mr. Shiflett leaves her with him, which is a sort of a ambiguous sort of note at that point, because what Mark says is that angels will be sent out from various positions to bring the elect. And you think to yourself, wait a minute, is now Lucy Nell, the daughter, one of these angels? I mean, have we missed the sign here too? Has everybody in the story missed this sign? And then Mr. Shiflett goes on the road again. The heavens cloud up in this very ominous, symbolic, and apocalyptic sort of way. He picks up another hitchhiker, his own sort of alter ego, in a sense, who then curses him and jumps out of the car, and Mr. Shiflett drives as fast as he can through this sort of apocalyptic landscape to the big city where he can get away from all this. So you have this sort of equilibrium, the disturbance of an equilibrium, the recognition. It's drawn out a little bit more in this story and problematized because there's a second intruder who comes in at the end. And then the first intruder flees from him, so that you've got this, again, this problematical use of that sort of basic scenario. Those two examples are one in which the first story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is the sort of simple or orthodox, let's say, imposition of that scenario, whereas The Life You Save May Be Your Own is a more complicated imposition of that template with changes to it. But you can do this too with Good Country People, in which Manly Pointer, the Bible salesman, comes into this sort of equilibrium with Joy, Hulga, and her mother, and disrupts it all, and so forth and so on. And so most of those stories in the early collection conform to that. But the one where I think it really works most fully is The Displaced Person. And I wanted to spend some time talking about that, not only because that, my own sort of theoretical elect hubris tells me that that I've got the pattern to impose on the story to make it work, but also because The Displaced Person is probably one of the top 10 best short stories written by an American ever. And so you would want to spend your time thinking in a critical sense about something that was worth it. So if you remember that story, it's a rather long one. If you remember that story, there is an initial equilibrium on Mrs. McIntyre's farm. It's not the most prosperous farm in the world in the South, but there is an initial equilibrium. There is a class equilibrium. There's Mrs. McIntyre at the top, Mrs. Shortley and Mr. Shortley. Think they're the second rank of white Southern people in charge of this sort of hierarchy of power and so forth. And then there's beneath them Astor and Sulk, the two black characters. Now this is where the imposition of this template in this story becomes interesting, because almost always Now I'll say this, almost always when O'Connor has an African-American character in her stories, and it's not in every one, the African-American characters, if you go along with this template from Mark that I'm playing with, almost always those African-American characters stand apart from that template. They are neither the elect who don't get it, or the elect who don't get it. Like, for instance, Hazel Motes in Wise Blood is like maybe the elect who doesn't think he's the elect, but he is. They stand apart. It's almost as if O'Connor recognizes the African-American character's existence, but doesn't recognize it in the theological register in which she places and recognizes the white characters. I don't know what to make of that, but the template that I'm imposing sort of suggests that. And it suggests, another inning, let's say, of critical thought about these stories to figure out, whether I'm right about the template and the black characters stand outside it, or whether I'm wrong about that and the black characters are actually central to the story and my template is wrong. You see what I mean? There's just another inning of talk to do about that. But anyway, there's this hierarchy. There's Mrs. McIntyre, Mrs. Shortley, and her husband, and then Astor and Salk, the black characters. And they get along for racial and class reasons. And a lot of the stuff in the early part of the story is mostly Mrs. Shortley. The first part of the story is mostly narrated through Mrs. Shortley's point of view, in which you get the orthodox or the normal explanation of where white people are, where black people are in the South, where work belongs, how, what efficiency means, how the whole machine, the Southern sort of social and pastoral or agricultural machine, how that all works. It doesn't work perfectly. It works pretty bad. But everybody's adjusted to the imperfections of the way it works because the way it works preserves racial and social prestige and status. So there's an equilibrium. Very obviously, into this equilibrium comes Father Flynn. We don't get his name until almost the end of the story. Comes this priest with the displaced persons, refugees, survivors of the Holocaust, the Gizaks, called the Gobblehooks, by Mrs. Shortley and Mrs. McIntyre. And they come into the equilibrium and immediately disrupt it. The first thing they disrupt is the idea of efficiency and the idea of racial hierarchy. The first thing that happens is Mr. Gizak proves to be a much more efficient farmer and a much more helpful mechanic and so forth than Mr. Shortley has ever been. He can operate machinery, he can repair machinery, he's efficient, he works all the hours that he's paid for, and he makes the farm actually pay. He actually makes it profitable. Mrs. Shortley especially, resents that deeply. But the form her resentment takes is that she starts to plant the seeds in the minds of the black characters that, if these displaced persons take over, then the first thing that's going to go is you. The first thing they're going to get rid of is you. And, she says there's millions and millions and millions of them over there, and if they all come over here, you all won't have a job anymore. So she Mrs. Shortley, tries to implicate Astor and Salk in defending an ideology that in fact subordinates them. Really interesting, this is sort of a sidebar or a sidelight to the story. There's a couple of scenes in which Astor and Salk just pretend not to hear what Mrs. Shortley is telling her, and pretend to misconstrue it or construe it other ways, as if they know what's going on and they know how they're being manipulated. They just choose not to recognize the point they're being manipulated or not to make an issue of it. They're going to survive in here regardless of what happens. So this gets a little bit more complicated as that story goes along. What also disrupts the story, and this is what makes it a really more interesting, well, a little bit more interesting than the other ones, is that Mrs. Shortley remembers seeing newsreel pictures of the Holocaust. She remembers seeing newsreel pictures of the liberation of the death camps, the concentration camps. And what that does to her, clearly in thematic terms in the story, what that does in thematic terms is that it makes her realize, although probably not consciously, that the social hierarchy which she believes identifies her is in fact irrelevant. There is no hierarchy. There are only body parts. Essentially, there are only bodies. And they can be mangled and revealed as such and dismembered and killed at any moment, which will render this whole sort of self-aggrandizing structure that she lives in, will render it all null and void in any instant. But she refuses to sort of recognize that. Now, what that does sort of in theological terms, it seems to me in the story, is it makes it impossible for Mrs. Shortley to recognize any theological basis for any of the action that goes on in the story. If she believes that, the ultimate meaning of her life in this world is social, class-oriented, and race-oriented, she's white, then she's not going to recognize the Christ when he shows up. She's not going to do it because she's going to be looking in the other direction. And it's pretty clear that for her, she militantly does not recognize Mr. Guzik, who is quite literally the savior when he shows up. He's not only the savior when he, fixes the tractors and runs the machinery properly, but he's also, if I got the right page here, he's also in one of those scenes that O'Connor uses pretty clearly. He's also in terms of imagery, this is later on in the story, but it's in the most sort of powerful moment when, if you remember the story, Mrs. Shortley has the first act, so to speak, and then Mrs. McIntyre comes in for the second act after the Shortleys decide to leave. And Mrs. McIntyre comes in, but she basically maintains the same regime or the same ideology that Mrs. Shortley did, except she maintains it from a higher social level. She's white, she's a landowner, she has all this responsibility for keeping this farm going. None of these people would have lives or work or income if she wasn't the one who was keeping all of this, You can hear the parable of the Pharisee and the publican just screaming out of this, everywhere. But then what happens increasingly, the straw that breaks all this to pieces is that Mr. Guzik promises his niece, I think, who is coming to the United States from a concentration camp, promises that his niece will marry Sulk, who's the young black kid who works on the farm. Sulk says, I'm going to marry her, and he shows a picture of her. And that is the recognition that Mrs. McIntyre can't admit. And then almost at the same moment, she looks at Mr. Guzik and says, "Monster," she said to herself, and looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. This is, the recognition scene, take heed, watch, okay? And in this particular case, Mrs. McIntyre takes heed and watches, but it's not because of an actual willed moment on her part. It's something she's wrestled or compelled to do from outside. His forehead and skull were white where they had been protected by his cap, but the rest of his face was red and bristled with short yellow hairs. I'm sure we could see that face somewhere along these walls. His eyes were like two bright nails behind his gold-rimmed spectacles that had been mended over the nose with hay wire. His whole face looked as if it might have been patched together out of several others, and so forth. That, you're obviously looking at the face of, a crucified Christ, aren't you? There's the, the crown of thorns, even the sort of off-center allusion to haywire and so forth. I mean, this is O'Connor also, and this is what makes me feel like the elect. And I get sort of these weird frisons. It's like, aha, I know how to read you better than you do. Because, I mean, I'm the elect. I know how to read this better than anybody else because I see, I take heed, I watch, I see these signs. Like, for instance, this is another sort of parentheses, but go back. If you remember, good man is hard to find. There are these, these signs too. They drive by a graveyard at one point. They come to a town named Tombsboro at one point. The misfit drives up in a hearse-like car at one point, and you think, take heed, watch. All of the signs say death, but none of the characters see it. So there's also, this is still in the parentheses, there's also this take heed, watch sort of stylistic attention that the critic has. The problem with that, it seems to me, and I can say this, as a sort of personal sort of confession, the problem with that is that it steers you off into the stylistic and the craft aspects of the story. And you think, how ingenious is this being put together when you're actually missing what it is it's put together for? And then what you have to do then is go back, it seems to me, and reconcile how it's put together with what you think it's put together for. And in this particular story, in The Displaced Person, I think it's put together by O'Connor for the purpose of, across the board, negating or criticizing or calling to account the Southern 1950s apartheid society in which she lives, which is, you were reading this earlier, which is also in a sort of comically unworldly, who thinks, Europe is just not as advanced as we are. Here they are, living in a late blooming tenant farm or whatever. Europe is not in advance. And also not recognizing the nature of evil as the Holocaust showed everybody, and not realizing also that the Southern white apartheid culture, which they embrace as orthodoxy or the normal, is in fact a form of Holocaust. It's not as overtly or as immediately violent, and it is a version of that sort of supremacy that allows Astor and Salk, for instance, and the Shortleys to live, but it doesn't allow them to live to the full equal status of their that they're entitled to as human beings. If you remember, part of that story is when the Shortleys leave Mrs. McIntyre's farm, they all pile into their sort of Jode-like vehicle, and they're all piled into it with one arm sticking this way and one leg sticking this way, and fingers sticking out and so forth. They look like a bunch of dismembered bodies trucking themselves away. They become displaced persons, except they don't know it, because they haven't broken through the husk of this orthodoxy that they live in. Now, people leaving because we're out of time? Or am I just being boring? Oh, okay. Let me just say a little bit more and then... Oh, okay. Be like Judy Garland. I'll stay here all night and we'll sing them all. What's also interesting, it seems to me, now here's where you can call me on this. I think Father Flynn doesn't get it either. I think when Father Flynn looks at the peacock and sees the magnificent beauty of the spread tail and says, Jesus will come like that one day, I think he doesn't get it either. He is watching in the wrong direction. He's looking for majesty. And I say this with a little bit more confidence than normal, because it seems to me, reading O'Connor's letters and other things she's written, she was pretty suspicious or skeptical of some clerics, some ordained priests and theologians who were, to her mind, a little bit too magnificent, a little bit too scholarly, a little bit too sort of like Titian or whatever, a little bit too Sacra Conversazione, like that painting. They're a little bit too magnificent. And they were looking in the wrong direction. They were looking for clouds and all that stuff, when they should have been looking for Mr. Guzik. They should have been looking in the world, just walking up to them. They should have been looking that way. Because there's a scene in the story in which Father Flynn, knowing that the Shortleys have, will have to be displaced, and even the black characters will have to be tossed off the farm, he says, he shows no sympathy for that whatsoever. He says, well, you'll just have to pay the Guziks more and keep them. And it seems to me he's looking in the wrong direction. He doesn't get the full picture either. And that the peacock can be a magnificent bird, but it can also be misconstrued. I mean, in other words, this is an example of Flynn, Father Flynn, who should be, or at least putatively should be one of the elect, is not. He's been over sort of seminariized. And so this is just, I mean, I think if you put the template on this story, this is why I like it better than some of the others, is because it squirms out of it in a lot of ways. And Mrs. McIntyre tries to reimpose at the end of the story an equilibrium by force. She colludes, the word is collude, it's in the story. She and Sulk, not Astor, it's the young black kid, do you remember? It's one of them. And Mr. Shortley, who's still around, Mrs. Shortley has died. They collude in allowing the tractor to roll down the hill over Mr. Guzik. They look at each other in this amazing scene at the end, almost slow motion. Remember the scene in Bonnie and Clyde where it's that scene. It's that they look, and the tractor rolls over the guy. They collude in his death, and the reason they do is because they would rather maintain the false equilibrium of their regional, racial, and social hierarchy than take heed and watch and recognize the Savior when he shows up. Because what the approach or the entrance of the Savior means in this story is that they have to give up all that they have previously embraced as defining them. There's something like that in better language in the Bible. What does Jesus tell the guy? Give away everything and follow me. Pretty simple and unambiguous. But Mrs. McIntyre won't do it. Nor will Father Flynn do it. Nobody will do it. And the end of that story is really powerful in that sense, because you see the sort of aftermath of the attempt to impose a false equilibrium. The farm goes into ruin. Mrs. McIntyre's health declines. And she and Father Flynn spend the rest of their days talking about theology in her nursing home. And that seems to me that talking about theology in a nursing home is a sort of a pale, maybe meaningless alternative to actually doing it. You're nodding, I guess. So I guess I'll stop there, since, unless you want to talk about everything that rises must converge. Or want to ask some questions about this template thing? Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you were talking about the African American characters being sort of outside of the elect, or the not elect, kind of separate.
Yeah, I think so.
I thought about, I'd like to know then what you do with the story Revelation, where
They're all marching into heaven ahead of everybody?
Yeah, she has a vision of the elect and is actually kind of shocked because the first people to go in are
The people she thought were the lowest.
folks on her farm.
Yeah.
And then when these white moralistic Southerners with all their,
They get in.
they get in, but only by having all of their moralism burned off of them as they go into heaven. And so it seems like she often is saying this sort of moralistic, elite, this kind of,
This false elect, this sort of self-nominated elect who aren't.
Turning it on redemptive characters, and especially in Revelation, because she actually sees the elect walking in. The ones that are redeemed kind of first are African American.
Yeah, but Mrs. Turpin doesn't understand how they could, by what process they got redeemed, because they didn't do all the stuff that she thought you had to do to get yourself saved. You know, they look like they weren't doing anything, and here they go in first. You know, Revelation, I think. I mean, I'm going to wiggle out of this question a little bit. Revelation is in the second collection, Everything That Rises Must Converge, and I admit and acknowledge right offhand that the template that I've been pushing works better on the first collection than it does on the second. I have a sort of theory, which I haven't worked out about that, is that her reading, or at least hearing about Teilhard de Chardin somehow changed the way she looked at that. In other words, I don't think that the verse from Mark works as well for the stories in that second collection, although it doesn't not work, but it doesn't work as well as some concepts from Teilhard and other things that she picked up from the mid-50s later work. That's my Houdini statement. And the other sort of honest statement is that Revelation is in some ways a throwback, because the template does work. And Mrs. Turpin does go through a revelation, and the heavens do speak to her at the end, because right before she has her vision, there's this boiling red, almost post-hydrogen bomb kind of heavens that tell her that something has happened. And then she has the vision and sees, everybody dancing, into heaven. So it does work to a certain extent. But you're right also in that story, at least in that, there's another African American character who shows up in that story too, a little bit earlier, doesn't he? I get them confused sometimes with. Doesn't he deliver a pizza or lunch or something to the? Yeah. Yeah, he's the drugstore delivery guy, and he shows up, and he has a kind of aura about him, and when he appears, that sort of sets him apart from the other characters, I think. But you're right about that story. The template fits, but then it fits with a reversal, or at least partly. Mrs. Turpin gets her comeuppance in the end, but she gets into heaven. She just has to wait and get in later than everybody else. But then if you're going to heaven, it doesn't, what's a few minutes,
Yeah.
David?
Michael, in the same story, Revelation, where does the character, the Radcliffe student, that is the agent provocateur,
See, those characters.
where does she fit in the grid?
She fits into the second collection grid as the disaffected, arrogant intellectual, like Julian in Everything That Rises Must Converge, like the two characters in the Partridge Festival. There's a bunch of stories there in which my template that I used here earlier won't fit, because there's obviously another agenda going on in which education. It also comes out in The Violent Bear It Away in the second novel, in which intellectualism, education, especially graduate education, turns out to be, a millstone around your neck, both intellectually, theologically, and psychologically. All these people are deeply unhappy and resentful of everybody else who is. And so like Julian and Everything That Rises, or the epileptic young woman in Revelation who throws, you're a warthog from hell, and throws the book at her. They become, and the two characters in the Partridge Festival, probably other ones I'm not remembering, become sort of cautionary figures of the dangers of education and intellectual pursuits that separate you, and this becomes ambiguous, separate you from a cliche-ridden, empty-headed, but nevertheless indigenous, family circle. I mean, there's no win for those people.
Is that another kind of false hierarchy for Flannery?
Yeah, I think it would be. And I can't help but, sometimes reading biographical stuff into that, because she herself, had, been to college and then been to Iowa, and probably at one point in her life before the lupus shut everything down, fancied the life of an urban intellectual, because she did try living in New York City, didn't she, for a while until she got sick. And I can't help but thinking that some residue of those sort of denied ambitions must come out in Joy, Hulga, must come out in her, must come out in Julian and the Partridge Festival people, and in the student in Revelation, and probably some other ones too. You just overthink. You think too much. You think you can get yourself saved by thinking. And one of the things that O'Connor is always, her theology always, and this gripes me too sometimes, is that thinking doesn't have any, what does thinking have to do with it? It doesn't have anything to do with it. And that gets a little, personally, that's one of the things that I try to, that's why I try to stay away from some of the stories sometimes, because I identify too much with, well, I don't really, but I don't identify enough with the other characters and a little bit too much with somebody like Julian. Well, anyway. But can we just say a few words about everything that rises must converge, and then I'll shut up. But everything that rises must converge. You all know the line from, that's the title of one of Teilhard's books, which O'Connor either read or read about. I'm not sure. And it always struck me that this is a little handout. If you can just take one and pass them around. She read Teilhard, I think, in the early 50s. And then again, or more seriously later on, according to her letters. She was always skeptical about him because she was always skeptical about hopeful, optimistic, utopian kinds of thinking about religion. I mean, it always seemed to her, at least I gather this from her stories and her letters, that was naive. That actual salvation or redemption took place in a much more problematic way. But she read Teilhard, and Teilhard was a priest, and Teilhard had the imprimatur of important theological people. And so she entertained the possibility that there was this kind of creative evolution, that the human race thought of not in microcosmic terms, but in macrocosmic terms. The human race thought of over millennia, eons, was in fact progressing from an alpha to an omega. And that, according to Teilhard, we were real close. If you see in this sort of weird sort of diagram, we're up there at the top where that little tiny omega is up at the top. And we're right, modern. We're right at the top. Although he says in the footnote or the caption to the diagram, this is not to scale, so don't get real anxious. It might take a couple of 100,000 years till we get there, but in comparison to the millions that have gone, through already, we're pretty close. And that kind of residual belief in human perfectibility, even if it comes from a priest, archaeologist or anthropologist like Teilhard. I always, Paleology, okay. It would seem to me always would set off alarms in O'Connor's head, that the whole idea of perfectibility. So what you've got in Everything That Rises Must Converge, that story, it seems to me is a sort of counter-allegory. Because I always think of that story that the title to that story is only half of the real title to the story. It should be Everything That Rises Must Converge with Everything That's Falling. And in that sense, everything that's rising in that story is the post-boycott, the post-bus boycott Southern African American population. That's why it takes place on a bus. And why the African American woman and her son are rising, and Julian and her mother and his mother are falling, and that they meet on the bus at the point where the African American mother and son are rising, and the Caucasian mother and son are falling. And the hats, the hats that the two women have seem to me, and this is totally just my own sort of private, my own sort of private sort of cleverness, is that the hats in the world are a takeoff on this design. That they're both wearing hats with little sort of blossomy omegas or whatever on the top of them. But one is going up and one is coming down. And the ironic sort of thing about them is that they meet in this sort of point in the middle where everybody but the little boy is a racist. In different kinds of racist, but everybody but the little boy is a racist. There is, you know, I tried to sort of impose my old template from Mark on the story, but it didn't work very well. At least if it did work, it worked in such generalized ways that it didn't really make any difference. But what's interesting about this story is that it is, to a certain extent, a rewriting of A Good Man Is Hard to Find. A lot of the things are similar. A lot of the elements of construction are similar. And the grandmother or the older woman dies at the end. And she gets killed, though. I'm still not sure what kills her. She has some kind of, clinically, she has some kind of stroke or something, I'm sure. But, clinically is not what we're after here. Why does O'Connor kill her? And I'm still not sure why. But she corresponds, the mother corresponds to the kid in the black couple. And the mother in the black couple corresponds to Julian. Because the mother in the black couple does to Julian's mother what Julian wants to do to her, but can't. And the mother, Julian's mother and the little boy get together because they're both naively innocent, she's addled kind of people. She's still racist, but in kind of residual way that tends to make no sense. She talks all this stuff about, being a God high, member of the God high family of whatever plantation society she came from, but clearly is, and Julian keeps saying over and over again, that's all gone, that's done, that's decayed, but she doesn't believe it. She's still swept up in that myth of herself, and that's this story seems to me to be keyed to O'Connor's skepticism about what was, I remember, being prevalent at that time in the early 60s and so forth when I was in some theology classes, that sort of post-Vatican II kind of sense like, we can be good people. We can perfect human nature, we can triumph over our own evil, depraved natures. And I don't think O'Connor ever believed that. And so this story operates, it seems to me, as a cautionary tale set in a Southern context where the evil nature projects itself as racism, in which, she ironically uses the title that underlies that hopeful sense that we can overcome everything. She ironically uses that title for a story that shows us that we can't. And so the relationship between the title and the story is ironic, but deliberate, I'm pretty sure. She says in her letters mostly, if I remember about Teilhard, mostly positive but cautious things. But I think she saves her real comment on that, on him, and on his theological viewpoint for this story. Which, well, that's, I'll just stop there. Yeah, probably is. And I need to go back and reread some of that Teilhard stuff, which I haven't read for decades. Any questions? Well, thanks for coming.